How do you change the narrative on a global scale for something that has historically been stigmatized or people might have misaligned, preconceived notions about? Well, you identify where people are struggling, how that thing or that issue might help, and you retarget with a message that addresses those pain points so that that message is easier to be received by the ideal audience. And luckily for you, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's episode. Welcome to the Storytelling Lab, where we break down the art and science of storytelling. My name is Bennett. I'm your host, and I'm a filmmaker and an author on a quest to understand how we can tell better stories so that we can do better work and make the world a better place. Each episode, I host one of the world's best storytellers to help you understand how to leverage storytelling to increase your sales, deepen your connections, and serve your audiences better. What's up, storytellers? Welcome back to the Storytelling Lab podcast. This is episode 190, and today my guest is Paul Austin. Today's episode is about psychedelics, psilocybin, which is mushrooms, LSD, acid, and the recent change in perspective, change in the overall narrative that we have witnessed in the general population. Let's just keep it here in the United States. Now, these are tools, we'll say, things that have been used, most of them natural, for thousands of years, different cultures all over the globe. However, we understand the stigma that tends to come with drug use, and some of that is certainly justified. I come from a long line of alcoholics, and there's been drug use in that as well. I have participated in a lot of that myself, so I know the dark side of those things. However, two of the most dangerous drugs on the planet, alcohol and tobacco, are perfectly legal at a certain age, of course. So we've seen the narrative, the story, if you will, of things like cannabis and things like psychedelics change. Paul is an expert in microdosing. That means taking little bits of it, not for the intended effect to really feel euphoria or to get high, so to speak, but to have little doses all along. And the effects of that have been profound. And they are certainly tied to all the things we talk about here on the Storytelling Lab, because what we see, what the data shows, and why it has been so widely accepted, it is because it is helping people overcome trauma, overcome depression and anxiety. It has been repositioned, I would say, as a tool for mental health, and it is working. It is being prescribed to people. The whole perspective on this has changed, but it has also really been adopted, and this might have been part of the reason why the perception has changed. It has been widely adopted by those folks pushing the business world forward, those in Silicon Valley, business folks who want the clarity that comes from microdosing, the creativity that comes from microdosing, also the community aspect of it all. This is all that we talk about in the Storytelling Lab. So I entered this conversation talking about how do you change the narrative of something so big that for so long has been looked at as quote unquote bad, for lack of a better term, and change that perspective. Well, we understand we have to come from a new angle, but also, and I'm not encouraging that you use anything, I'm just encouraging that you listen to this episode, because also there are a lot of benefits, and there always have been for humanity, for humankind, in using these psychedelics of various forms. So I want you to listen to this episode, because I'm not saying it's for you, but maybe it'll change your perspective and your perception of these things. And most importantly, it will help you understand how to communicate your messages in a way that will land the way you want them to land, the way your audiences need them to land, so that it can be received and not rejected. So here's my conversation with Paul Austin, and I hope that you love it. Paul, welcome to the Storytelling Lab.
It's great to be here, Rain. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to dive in today on microdosing, psychedelics, storytelling. This has been a space that I've been in for about a decade now, and it's been really fun to to tell stories within it in terms of how psychedelics, how microdosing impacts us historically, but also presently. And I'm excited to be on today to go deeper.
Dude, me too. And there's so many different ways I see that this could potentially tie into what we talk about often on the show. I mean, you have the larger narrative around psychedelics that I'm sure you're helping to shift. You have the community aspect of storytelling and belonging, right? As well as I know that finds itself quite a bit into the world of psychedelics as well. The connection between people, right? That's storytelling. And then, of course, just sharing the stories of microdosing, the clarity that comes from it, the creativity that might be sparked. Anyways, I'm excited because I'm not exactly sure where we'll go, but all of these seem like possibilities. I want to start with, like, this has got to be somewhat new. I know you've been doing this for a decade. So, like, I'm curious, what do you call yourself in terms of a title? Like, and specifically, how do you consider yourself? You might have a LinkedIn title that might not be exactly aligned with how you, your perspective of what you do.
I would say over the last decade, probably the predominant way that I've showed up is as a founder.
Yeah.
So I've started 3 companies within the psychedelic ecosystem. Third Wave as an educational and media brand. A retreat center called Synthesis, where we did high dose psilocybin retreats for over 1,000 people, and now the Psychedelic Coaching Institute, where we train coaches and practitioners. So fundamentally, I love to start new projects, grow them to about 7 figures. I'm really good at from nothing to 7 figures. I would say the other thing is teacher. That's a big part of how I would define myself. Even prior to getting into the psychedelic space, I taught English. It was my first job out of university. I moved to Turkey where I taught English. And then the first online business I started was a teaching English platform where I created courses and did trainings, individual and group trainings. And so at the center of my work is really being a teacher, a facilitator, a coach.
Yeah.
I love to help mentor, advise people on not only just psychedelics and microdosing, but like what's true health look like.
Yeah.
What's physical, emotional, spiritual, relational, financial, even wealth look like, and how can psychedelics help us to sort of reprogram our definitions of true health and true wealth. So that's a great opening. Founder and teacher probably are the 2 that resonate most. Yeah,
it's funny how the teaching skill set it seems to be, from my experience, either like woven into your veins or not. Like I find myself the same way. Like I coach storytelling and filmmaking. I also coach my daughter's like soccer team. Like I enjoy the act or the art of conveying information in a simple form so that someone else can leverage that or utilize that. So I think that's really cool and important that you come from an educational background, because with something like this, I imagine part of your job, at least the first portion of it, is educating people, because it's still like I've been hip to this because I used psychedelics recreationally, being transparent, growing up, and then also as an adult more interested in what we're talking about today, which is microdosing for clarity, performance, connection, etc. But even though it's been, for lack of a better word, somewhat mainstream for quite a while now, to be fair, it's still not like fully accepted. It's getting there. I mean, obviously that's subjective in terms of how you view that. But for example, I have a friend right now who's dealing with a chronic condition. She's interested in it, but it's very opaque, not sure where to get information. So if you're looking to coach someone on this thing that they've been hearing about and they've read a Forbes article about and they've heard Tim Ferriss talk about, I imagine that a lot of your work would start with, okay, let's break down what it is, what it isn't, et cetera, et cetera. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, education is the foundation for informed decision-making when it comes to psychedelics. Psychedelics are ancient technologies. They're medicines that we've used for thousands of years. And for the most part, they've been used underground. They've been used in secrecy. They've been used in a way that isn't just everyone and every person is sort of becoming interested in them. It's only in the last decade that because of the research that's come out about their efficacy for PTSD, depression, addiction, anxiety, that this is becoming more of a mental health solution. And so some really interesting stats for your audience to consider when it comes to education and adoption and, how this third wave has really grown and developed. In 2023, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms in the United States. Okay, 8 million people in 2023 took psilocybin mushrooms. That was 4x the number of people who took a psychedelic in 2019. So the number of people who took a psychedelic quadrupled from 2019 to 2023.
It's crazy.
Partly in response to COVID,
Sure.
and the pandemic and isolation and mental health. But I think also partly in response to more people becoming aware of the potential benefits of it and how it could be useful and helpful. I think the other interesting statistic here is out of those 8 million, about 4 million of those people actively microdosed, which is interesting. So it's about a 50-50 split. You had a lot of people who took mushrooms who either were interested in it therapeutically at a high dose or maybe just recreationally. They took a half gram or a gram or a stem and a cap when they were out and partying or at a festival or with friends or whatever that is. And then you had a lot of people who were intentionally microdosing. And microdosing for me has always been this bridge from an educational perspective to allow people to actually get into the experience of working with psychedelics. Because a lot of people in that educational phase, they do a lot of research and at times they get stuck in the research phase. I want to learn all about ketamine. I want to learn all about mushrooms. I want to learn all about MDMA. But it's intimidating sometimes to take that first step and actually make it happen. And so what I found with a lot of folks is being able to just take a microdose, a very low dose. It's not going to significantly disrupt your everyday life. People, when they do it consistently, they notice that, oh, wow, I have a little more energy. My mood's a little bit better. I'm sleeping a little bit better. I'm a little more patient. I'm a little more open. I'm a little more maybe honest and transparent. So there's just these small shifts that start to happen that then open them up to the possibility of, well, if I'm experiencing some of these benefits, I wonder if I increase the dose level, might that have a more profound impact? And so some people do that, and some people just continue to microdose, and they're perfectly content with that microdosing protocol.
What was your experience with usage prior to this venture? I know you didn't just jump into third wave, but did you use psychedelics growing up or recreationally, or what's your background with that?
So I grew up in a small suburb of a small city in West Michigan. The town that I grew up in is a town called Granville, which aptly describes it. If any of your listeners have seen the movie Pleasantville, kind of has that vibe,
Gotcha. Yeah.
So very Midwest, very religious, very traditional. And so drugs were like a big
sure.
no-no. I mean, especially in my family, I grew up very, very sheltered. And so I naturally rebelled against that. I tend to be a bit of a independent thinker. And so at the age of 16, I was introduced to cannabis and tried cannabis for the first time. Soon after, my parents found out, and as you can imagine, they were not happy. And yet the experience itself was quite fun and interesting, and it helped me to overcome a lot of the social anxiety or the feeling of peer group isolation that I was going through at that time. So it was useful. And then a few years after that, I the same friend who introduced me to cannabis introduced me to psilocybin mushrooms. And I was 19 when I had my first mushroom experience. It was about 2 grams, the equivalent of 2 dried grams. It was with 2 other friends in a private home. We played The Wall by Pink Floyd. So fucking
Who told you
cliche.
To do that? I know, dude. That's perfect.
Yeah, we just put it up there. I'm like,
This is what you're supposed to do.
It was the basement of my fraternity house, and we had a massive projector, and we just put up the wall on this massive projector and watched that. And my first experience was interesting, but it wasn't life-changing. I did LSD about 5 months after that. And when I started to get into LSD, I was often doing LSD in the woods, in nature, like with a friend or two. And that, for me, is what really turned me on to the power of what psychedelics could do. And so in my college years, I dabbled 15 or 20 times, usually with a friend or two or three in the woods on
So good.
not a super high amount, but definitely more than a microdose.
Yeah.
And I just had these really beautiful opening experiences. And a lot of the downloads and messages I was getting is carve your own path, don't follow a conventional path, be who you want to be, have the courage now to do it. Because if you try to do this when you're in your mid 30s, it's going to be much easier. Just like go and be free for your 20s, be a free spirit. So that's then what informed this path of becoming an entrepreneur, living and traveling abroad. I mean, I traveled to over 80 countries in my 20s across mostly Asia and Europe, but a few other places as well.
Yeah.
And then in 2015, I was living in Budapest, and Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan were starting to publish podcasts. Cannabis was being legalized, and more research was coming out about psychedelics. So I started Third Wave as a way to help steward the movement, help educate people, and give them a good platform and good place to get real high quality education about microdosing and psychedelics broadly.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a similar culture, Eastern North Carolina, small town, conservative town. My parents, well, alcohol was in the picture, at least with my dad, but not drugs. And they were all very stigmatized. Cannabis, obviously any harder stuff, psychedelics, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that helped in the 2015 era when you've got these people that are talking about it because it was so taboo. Again, I go back to like that world was very opaque. People didn't know unless you participated, which I did participate. By the way, side note, are your folks still around?
They are, yeah. They still live in the same house. I actually guided my dad through a mushroom journey about 5 years ago. So they really had a 180,
That's
if
what I was
you
going to
will.
ask. Yeah.
And they're much more open and understanding, and it's like it's all good now. But initially, when I told them about 10 years ago, they were not too thrilled that I was taking LSD consistently.
What changed your dad's perspective, I wonder?
Well, my mom was always the much more intense one, partly largely because she had an older sister whose life was ruined by drug abuse.
That'll do
and
it.
So she was very sort of skeptical of it, whereas my dad was not necessarily like super opposed, but he also wasn't supportive. And we just have a very loving, trusting relationship. So when Michael Pollan's book came out, How to Change Your Mind, in 2018, I sent him that book to read. He read it. He started to microdose. And then about a year after that, he was open to me guiding him through a mushroom journey. And it was profound for him. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, wow. But he definitely had some really deep insights about his relationships with his parents. And now at some point he's about to retire. Once he retires, I think I'll bring him to the jungle and we'll drink ayahuasca together.
That still had to be a pretty cool experience for you, I imagine.
Yeah, it was really meaningful for them to be open that way and to go through with that experience, to be seen and held in that way. And I think it also speaks to the power of like, I grew up in a sheltered environment and quite religious, but I also had parents who have continued to be very loving and supportive of whatever I've done.
That's cool.
And I think that's allowed me to focus on this work professionally because I have a deep sense of inner psychological safety in a way. And so I can be a little more courageous about being on the edge of reality to some degree.
Also, I think after some years, I experienced this myself, there hopefully, if your parents are open, there tends to be a little more than a little trust develops, right? If they've seen that you're not just like throwing your life away and you're very, your constitution is intact and your passion, then eventually that trust hopefully carries over if you've got a good relationship. That's awesome. I was going to ask, so very stigmatized any of the, drugs when I was growing up, not just in my community, in our society. And I know a lot of friends who were on the front lines of the legalization of cannabis fight and are still there, but for decades. It seems to me, correct me if you disagree with this, but it seems to me that that the conversation about psychedelics and being more widely accepted and even legalized seemed to go much faster than the conversation with cannabis has, in my opinion. So, and I wonder if you agree with that, why you think that might be. You might have touched on it earlier, but I'm just curious. From my perspective, it seems like for 40 years we've been trying to legalize marijuana, and then in the past 10 years we've just seen a rapid acceptance of psychedelics.
Yeah, so cannabis laid the groundwork for psychedelics. So little bit of history lesson here, because I think history is informative in this way.
For sure.
The drugs that have been predominantly accepted over the last, let's say, 400 years of industrialization have been drugs that have fit well into this ethos of productivity, of colonization, of working hard. And those drugs have been caffeine. Those drugs have been nicotine from tobacco, and the other drug has been alcohol. So alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, those have been really the only socially acceptable drugs. They help us, two of them, nicotine and caffeine, help us to focus. Alcohol helps us to unwind and sort of, relax from the day. When cannabis and psychedelics came on the scene in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a lot of stigma around it. There was a subculture that used it. It opened up doors, but it never became fully integrated and accepted. And so when it came back on the scene, right, with medical marijuana in 1996, when California approved medical marijuana, I think cannabis was sort of the gateway drug to a massive reevaluation and reconsideration of, well, our drug policies are not rooted in scientific fact. In other words, it's not because, for example, LSD is riskier than alcohol that we've made LSD illegal. In fact, if you look at the data, LSD is quite a bit safer than alcohol. It's less addictive, it's less toxic, there's greater neuroplasticity, et cetera, et cetera. But our drug policies are not based in fact. So I think there's been more nuance that's been brought into the conversation. Cannabis opened that door, and then psychedelics has sort of followed cannabis, and there was some early momentum with psychedelics, right? We saw Oregon legalize psilocybin mushrooms in 2020. We then saw Colorado legalize plant medicines, which was psilocybin mushrooms, San Pedro, iboga, 5-MeO-DMT, and ayahuasca in 2022. But it's been a bit of a freeze lately, in that Massachusetts had a bill to legalize psychedelics in this prior election that was rejected. And MDMA assisted therapy was brought to the FDA for approval, and they rejected it. And so we're now at a place we're recording this April 1st, 2025, where the psychedelic space has entered a bit of hibernation. And in a way that's actually, I think, a positive development, because it was moving very quickly. A lot of concern was there's not enough guides and practitioners who really know what they're doing in order to roll this out in a way that can scale very quickly. And if you have a bunch of people who are doing this quote unquote novel drug without the proper guidance and support, the vast majority of people will still have positive or at the very least neutral experiences, but there will be a small but mighty percentage of people who have very challenging and difficult or negative experiences. And so I think to avoid a lot of what happened in the 60s, which was this massive backlash against the use of psychedelics, there is more of a patient sort of lens that's being brought to this. And I will say, like, the cat's out of the bag at this point in time. Like, it's not going back. This is this is a bit of a plateau that we've hit, but I think we'll bust through it. And look, we're also somewhat seeing this in the cannabis space. Now I don't know how many states have legalized it. It's something like 15 or 16 now. There are a lot of states that have medicalized it. But like, speaking even for myself, I've had a kind of problem with cannabis addiction over the last 5-6 years, and just started to use it too often because it's become so accessible. And I think a lot of people are coming to recognize and realize, yes, cannabis needs to be legalized, and we need better education around it. And, people need to be better informed about the potential negative effects on brain health and, testosterone and all these other things that I don't think are as talked about necessarily regarding cannabis.
That's a super good point. Like, you have to do so much work at dismantling the narrative of the negatives, the cons of it that were push for so long, right? Like the falsehoods.
It's like deconstruction is
Right.
the first step.
And then uplift, the positive narrative around it. But then sometimes that's done with a little bit of negligence or overlooking the actual negative things that could come from. That's a really interesting
balance.
Point. Totally.
Right? So
and that applies to anything.
Swings
Yes,
again,
absolutely.
And it's like, actually, we got to bring it back here.
Yeah.
Where I think cannabis is really useful for people who, they're on maybe opiates for pain, or they're on certain medications for PTSD and it's not working. But if I'm honest, most of the high performers that I know, they are held back by their cannabis use. If you're not on psychiatric medications, if you don't have an active trauma, if you're not in deep pain, I think cannabis every now and then, like once every couple months, can be a really great creative inspiration. But if it's used too often, it just becomes this crutch of disassociation and numbing out. This has been my experience.
Yeah. I was working on a project some years ago with Rick Cusick of High Times, who's associate editor at High Times, and he had this program, kind of a one-man show we were trying to develop into a film called Reefer Dadness. He was a single father, and he was raising his daughter, and he's the High Times guy, the public-facing figure for High Times, one of those people I was alluding to earlier that had been fighting the fight for decades. And he was like, no, I don't think my daughter should smoke weed, and he kind of caught at least people who didn't know him well off guard. And they're like, why? You're like pushing for this to be legalized. It's like, yeah, but there's still all of these emotional issues. Just like I don't want my 16-year-old daughter driving fast or having sex. Like there's a lot of regulation emotionally that still needs to be done. And it's not there for a child yet. And that was one of the first times I saw someone who was really pushing for the acceptance and legalization of it. Understand and articulate that it doesn't mean it doesn't have negative effects. So I think that's important to include. Shifting back to the microdosing, who tends to respond most to your work, like what you do, or seek out your work, if you could label it? Is there a certain type or a certain industry?
So microdosing, it really kicked off in earnest in 2011. There was a book published called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, and there was one chapter in that book dedicated to microdosing. And it detailed or outlined a lot of the anecdotal reports of people who were microdosing. And just so your listeners are aware, the fundamentals of microdosing is it's about 1/10 of a regular dose of a psychedelic, usually psilocybin mushrooms or LSD. It's done 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, for anywhere from a month to 2 months to 3 months. So that's what we call the protocol. And when people microdose, I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. The most sort of clinically established benefits is they have more energy, they have a better mood, and they get better sleep. And so I find that there are, for sake of clarity, 2 main archetypes that are attracted to microdosing. One is people who are depressed, who have PTSD, who have maybe addiction issues, who even struggle with anxiety, who might be on ADHD medications or things like Prozac or Lexapro, SSRIs, antidepressants, and they're just sick of being attached or tied to this addictive psychiatric medication. They want to get off of it. It's no longer working or worthwhile. It's become a crutch for them. And they see microdosing as a tool that can help them to navigate a transitionary period where they may need a little bit of extra help to kind of get themselves back in a really good place. And so I see a lot of people who are in that transition who lean on microdosing or low doses of psychedelics to help with that. That is not the main population that I support. We have some of those folks who come in. We have a group experience called the Microdosing Experience, which is a 6-week group coaching experience. We have some folks who come in for that from that lens. But I'm not a clinical therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a clinician whatsoever. And so my focus tends to be more on individuals who are high performers, who are interested in flow, who are interested in optimization, better relationships, better communication. And I love specifically working with high performers who are interested in LSD in particular, microdoses of LSD, because I find a lot of entrepreneurs, creatives, and high performers, LSD just really works for their brain. because a lot of us, especially in the day of in the age of tech, have at least a slight form of ADHD. And I find that these low doses of LSD can help us to stay focused, to get locked in, and to bring a level of playfulness to our work, which I think is increasingly important and relevant in the age of AI. That those who can be more creative, who can be more playful, who can also align around a mission that has a deeper sense of meaning and purpose for the world around them. And I find just LSD seems to do really, really well in that lens. And that's because compared to mushrooms, LSD is more what we call dopaminergic. And dopaminergic is a word that comes from dopamine. So there's more dopamine that's coming through when you're microdosing with LSD, and dopamine is tied to focus, attention, and motivation. And so usually when I work with high performers and entrepreneurs, microdosing, keep in mind, is a bridge, it's a catalyst, it's an opener. Oftentimes when I'm first working with them, it's to help them calibrate, find their dose level, figure out, is it 2 times a week? Is it 3 times a week? And then once we're in a flow, then it's, okay, well, what is the larger picture of your life right now? And what are some of the deeper goals or objectives that you're working through or towards? And I find most often, and this is true, especially these days, people are going through a massive transition. And I think especially professional transition. And so I find a lot of the clients that I'm working with, at least one-on-one, I'm helping them to navigate that professional transition, to be able to take the courageous leap that they know that they need to take, to no longer work just to make a paycheck, but to actually find work that is deeply meaningful for them. And those are the folks that I tend to attract and basically pull in most.
That's helpful. I appreciate that. And just for in practical terms, when you're microdosing LSD, is it in liquid form?
So there's 2 main forms. One is liquid, a tincture. The other one, which I've become more of a fan of just because it's easier to source, is gummies. Really nice gummies. So we work with a company called Golden Rule Mushrooms, and they actually have little LSD microdosing gummies. And so people can just sort of go to that website, openly order them. They ship it from Colorado, and it's very easy to do, which brings up a whole nother conversation, which is because we have so many millions of people who are now microdosing and the DEA is so focused on fentanyl, there's like 100 websites now that you can go to, you can order mushrooms, they'll ship it to your house, and it'll show up a week later, and you can just be microdosing, no problem. It's fully illegal. This is not a legal thing necessarily, but it's everywhere now. It's totally insane how popular and widespread this has become, and how frankly the FDA and the DEA has done really nothing about it at all, which is fascinating.
How do you feel about that? Does that excite you or does that worry you?
Both. Yeah, I started a nonprofit a few years ago called the Microdosing Collective. We're a 501c3 out of California. And that is the focus of the Microdosing Collective, is how do we create a regulatory structure that provides consumer protection? Because the biggest risk with all of these sort of random websites and chocolate bars and gummies popping up is there's no consumer protection. So they can say they can put whatever they want in it. They can say whatever they want is in it. And there's been a couple problematic cases that it's led to where people think they're taking psilocybin, but they're really taking something else. And then that causes issues and problems.
Yeah, it's funny when the guy, the hookup is maybe the safer option. Right. I mean, you don't know if you're ordering it from across the country unless you have reputable sources. So that's a great endeavor. I think that's really great that you're offering that. That was where I was going with the LSD. It was just like, that seems harder to me. This is a little bit of a tangent to microdose or to control the microdose. Whereas psilocybin, if you have dried mushrooms, it's physical form. I mean, you can see that it's just a little bit versus a gram. I feel like if people on their own were microdosing LSD in the liquid form, it could perhaps get out of hand quickly. But
you can dilute it, right?
Yeah,
so dilution is important. And to your point, you can't. People will just tell you, okay, it's about this potency, it's about this strength. If you have 1 drop, it's about this amount. But there's no way to test that. Whereas with mushrooms, you can grow them, you can get them, you can weigh them, and you can see, okay, this is 100 milligrams. Now, The flip side of that is mushrooms always have different potency. So depending on the batch, depending on the strain, right? So you could literally have the same strain of mushroom, but it could be from 2 different batches, 100 milligrams, and it'll feel different. Whereas with LSD, 10 micrograms is 10 micrograms. So there's a bit more consistency there. And all of this would be addressed and fixed if we just figured out some form of regulatory structure and third-party testing system where people know, okay, if I'm taking this, it has this amount, and we could just make this accessible and available. And when I started this work 10 years ago, the reason I started this work is because I was like, this doesn't make sense. And I'm a very sort of logic and rational person. And if something doesn't make sense, I'm like, it has to be fixed. And that was, with psychedelics being illegal, that was really for me, one of the core things. I'm like, reality doesn't make sense unless these things are accessible and available, because they're so useful, they're so helpful. We've been using them for thousands of years. And the fact that they're prohibited is just absurd. Like, it's just totally, totally absurd.
Yeah, I agree. Talk to me about consistency in terms of results. I saw you on a video say something about when you start to really feel the results. Maybe people, come to you and they're expecting to take one microdose and like, oh my gosh, I'm cured. And I like this conversation because I feel like it applies to anything you're trying to achieve results with.
It needs at least a month. That's what I tell people, right?
Okay.
Like, be in the practice for at least a month. The parallel that I often draw is like with mindfulness meditation. So when you start to meditate, you don't sit down on the cushion for 20 minutes and expect to be enlightened, nor do you expect, hopefully, that all of a sudden you'll be more patient, less reactive, more clear, get better sleep, right? Like, there's a practice, and to really reap the benefits of a meditation practice, usually you got to sit on the cushion for a minimum of 15 minutes a day for 30 days straight. And after that, you'll start to notice some benefits from it. You'll be calmer, you'll be more patient, you'll be less reactive, et cetera, et cetera. Microdosing is similar, that in the early clinical research that they've published on microdosing, they've shown that the greatest effect from microdosing comes after taking a microdose 2 times a week for a minimum of 4 weeks. So usually what I tell folks is at least 2 times a week. Oftentimes people will just pick like a Tuesday and a Saturday, or a Wednesday and a Sunday, or a Thursday and a Sunday. So 2 times during the week. They'll just keep it consistent on that same day, that same time. And that after about 4 weeks, they should see the greatest impact on mood, energy, and sleep. After that, then it becomes a question of what other modalities are you choosing to weave in with that microdosing protocol. And so what we often teach is that microdosing is not a magic pill, that you should not be dependent or use it as a crutch to feel better or have more energy and mood. It should be a catalyst, an opener. And so whenever I coach people, there's always a practice that we are integrating as part of it. Most commonly, it's meditation, because a lot of people, you'd be surprised, still don't consistently meditate. But it might be breath work, it might be walks, it might be just sitting in silence, it could be journaling, right? There's other practices, but the whole intention around microdosing and general psychedelic use, from my lens, is long-term behavioral change, right? That one of the greatest impacts that microdosing and psychedelics have is their impact on neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And that capacity for the brain to be plastic allows people to shift and change behaviors. So I'm always asking, what is the core practice or behavior that you can commit to and integrate, so that after this microdosing protocol, whether it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 2 months, that practice continues irrespective of whether or not you're still taking the drug itself.
Got it. I saw something that this might have been on your site that was questioning or poking holes at the concept of one-on-one therapy. And it was through the lens or the perspective of the community of doing this as a collective. Talk to me about the importance of that, because this is something that's really embedded in the storytelling world too, is the aspect of collaboration and creativity and community connection with other people.
So one of my principles, if you will, or philosophical foundations, comes from this really brilliant writer, Nassim Taleb, who you may have heard of. He wrote The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile and things like that. And he writes about this thing called the Lindy effect. And the Lindy effect is basically the longer an idea or technology has been around, the longer it will continue to be around. In other words, survival of an idea or technology indicates utility.
Right.
And so one of the examples he uses is the Bible, right? The fact that we still are reading the Bible 1,800 years after the Nicene Creed was developed or the Nicene Council came together is a likely indicator that another 2,000 years from now, people will still be probably reading the Bible. Whereas that, sort of slutty romance novel that your girlfriend or your partner is reading that came out last year, the likelihood that we'll still be reading it 10 years from now is basically nil. Right?
Hey, 50 Shades of Grey is a masterpiece.
Exactly. Yeah, maybe that. Maybe that one. And so if you look at historically how psychedelics have been used, they've always been in groups, almost always been in groups. There are some use cases, for example, in the Amazon where shamans will drink ayahuasca themselves to perform healing rituals on people. But by and large, it is used and has been used in a group format. And this is true in the Amazon. This is true in Mexico with psilocybin. This is true in ancient Greece and ancient Rome as part of the Eleusinian mysteries. There was always a group sort of community ritual dynamic to it. It's only in the last 50 years when psychotherapy, this one-to-one work, has become much more relevant, where we pathologized certain aspects of being, that this sort of one-to-one thing has become relevant. Now, I do think that for some people who have deep issues, for example, with addiction or complex PTSD or treatment-resistant depression, there's a deep trauma that wants to be healed and brought up. Doing that within a one-to-one container at first can be really useful and helpful. And I would say the vast majority of people would benefit much more from the group experience and group dynamic and the community dynamic, because at the center of a lot of our malaise in 2025 is a sense of isolation and loneliness. And these, what I would call like shared group experiences of ecstasy and awe and oneness, there is just something that it does for the soul that's incredibly nourishing. And so when we're able to be in community, when we're able to be seen and loved in community and held in community, there's an experience there that you don't have when you're just one-to-one talking with a therapist or a coach. And so I'm a really big advocate for this model for psychedelics, which is focused on churches, community, retreats, even, for our training program for practitioners. It's a 10-month certification program. We do things virtually quite a bit for most of the program, but we all meet in Costa Rica for a week and we do medicine work together. Because I've found that the knowledge, the information is helpful, it's important, it elicits greater confidence. But the thing that really sticks with people over the long term are the relationships that are created and woven together. And those then end up being those professional collaborators for, years, if not decades, in terms of this career transition that a lot of these folks are making.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the conversation about this topic, especially with the help of Michael Pollan's book and the Rogans and Ferrises of the world, are in the workspace, basically. People looking at it from the perspective of performance, clarity, et cetera, et cetera. What role does that currently play, or what role would you like it to play in the workplace? Do you want to see it widely adopted? Why are people so interested in it that are founders and entrepreneurs like yourself? People hear that and they're like, "Oh, is it like the limitless drug? Are people trying to pursue this? Okay, you seem to see where I'm going."
So in the 1950s, Ken Kesey,
Yes.
Ken Kesey wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He was part of experiments at Stanford with LSD. This was the early clinical research. And this is a whole nother rabbit hole, but it included something called MK Ultra, the CIA, and LSD. And Ken Kesey was part of these experiments. He snuck a bunch of LSD out of the Stanford lab in Palo Alto, brought it into the community, and that ended up leading to the Grateful Dead and the acid tests and the pretty widespread use of LSD. And one of the people who got his hands on that LSD was a guy named Jim Fadiman. And Jim, at that point in time, was training to be a psychologist. He was young, and he joined a couple people in the 1960s. I forget the exact name of it, but they were essentially giving LSD to managers and engineers and inventors. And what they found is when they'd give them about a moderate dose of LSD, it would be incredibly helpful in helping them to solve problems and be more creative. And I think what a lot of folks don't know is the reason we have Silicon Valley today is because of LSD. The LSD was really the thing that initiated or catalyzed the development of Silicon Valley. So the reason I mention all of that context is because the loop that was opened in the 1960s, right, around the computer revolution and being able to talk and communicate and the internet, that loop is now, I think, coming to a full circle with AI, right? And so all of a sudden, the initial intention of that information revolution, that computer revolution in the 1960s, is coming to a close because a lot of the white collar work that we have been so occupied with will soon be handled by artificial intelligence. And so the question for many of us then becomes, what do we do? And I think psychedelics really help people to address these existential questions of why am I here? What am I doing? What is meaningful to me? How can I help be generative or give back? And how can I do it in such a way that I'm able to inspire and lead both myself, but also those who are around me? And so I think psychedelics offer us a fantastic tool, technology, to not only come up with creative solutions about how to be more resourceful in the age of AI, but also creative solutions about how to develop a new paradigm, is what I would argue, that is rooted in this fundamental sense of interdependency, interbeing, interconnectedness. So much of business for the last 400 years, as part of industrialization, has been rooted in what I would call extraction, right? Taking things from, let's say, the earth and building. It could be mining, it could be with coal, it could be with steel, whatever. We're taking things, we're building it. There's not a lot of reciprocity, which is why we now have an ecosystem that is imbalanced and really suffering. And so I see the greatest task of the next 10 to 15 years as our time and energy is freed up through AI. How do we dedicate that time and energy to being generative or regenerative, specifically for our natural ecosystem, through the recognition that our health, both individually and collectively, is intimately tied to the health of the ecosystems that we exist within. And I think that, to me, is where psychedelics, like, they help us to anchor in that, remember in that, and then be inspired to do something about it.
That would be nice. A lot of what you just said reminds me, there was a book that came out, I want to say 2017, Humility is the New Smart. Are you familiar with that?
I am not, no, but I'm going to add
you would
that to
dig
my
it
list.
a lot. It kind of flew under the radar, but it was a great book. But the concept was, discussing AI and a lot of things that we were just talking about. And there was like 4 new smart qualities that they talked about humans would need to possess or enhance as we move forward in this time. And I can't remember all of them, but it's basically empathy, creativity, collaboration. Like, if we're going to compete, for lack of a better word, with AI, with robots, the way that we do that is together, right? Collaboratively, working together, being creative, not trying to outwork them or outsmart them, which will not happen. And it sounds a little bit like what you were saying. Do you think that, what is your thought on that? Do you think that is true or true-ish? And if so, do you think that psychedelics may help us really reach the depths or enhance those? They're inherently human tools, but we kind of got away from them for a while in terms of really focusing on building our creativity, collaboration, etc.
Yeah, I pulled this up, and it says, drawing on research, the authors emphasize that the key to success in this new era is not to be more like the machines, but to excel at the best of what makes us human. And there's another great book that was written by a mentor of mine, a mentor and friend, called Team Human. It's written by this guy, Douglas Rushkoff, who's a sort of New York intellectual. And I think that for me is when I talk about this third wave of psychedelics, the first wave being the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelics, the second wave being the counterculture. The third wave is really, how do we exist in our modern moment, knowing the tools that are at our disposal, having clarity about the clinical benefits or the clinical research that exists around psychedelics, but really at the center of it, it's a retrieval of indigenous wisdom or ancient wisdom that we are actively choosing to weave back in. So there's an opportunity to I would say decondition or de-armor from the machine archetype or the sort of machine world that we exist within. And Aldous Huxley also talked a lot about this. He said, one of the greatest tasks of the 20th century is to stop the onward march of the machine, right? I mean, even if you look at the language we use, hardware, download, software, double click, right? A lot of the language now is sort of, we treat ourselves like machine. And I think the greatest task is how do we remain human? How do we remain in our emotions? How do we remain in our biological sort of truths? How do we remain in a way that is alive and vital and being us? And there's no, as you know, there's no black and white in this because, we have pacemakers now as an example, or there are cyborgs that, literally have, fake legs and fake arms. So there will always be a way that we continue to integrate with technology, but at the crux of us, at the core of us, can we still have these deep human elements?
Yeah.
And I think we have to, right? That's what will provide us the sort of longevity to continue to exist going forward.
Well said. There was, I know we've got a couple more minutes. There was a line maybe from your website that I had seen, which ties into what we're saying, which I really liked. It was, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's like prophets weren't mystics, they were pattern recognizers, and it wasn't about, they weren't seeing visions but seeing systems. I just thought that concept, the visualization of that concept, was so cool and landed so well for me. It even made me, there's something Seth Godin said one time where it's like, it's not about collecting dots but connecting the dots, which I thought was a really simple way of putting it too. Talk to me before we go briefly about, like, let's unpack that a little bit, because I love the idea of like psychedelics allowing you to tap into being able to see the game, right? To not to see the patterns, which is so important for unlocking anything.
Yeah, that was my sort of core experience when I was 19 and 20 and doing LSD for the first time. It was this recognition of, what are all the ways in which I'm not free, in which I am not sovereign? What are all the ways in which I'm still dependent on a system that is poisonous and toxic, whether that's food supply, whether that's pharmaceuticals, whether that's, the media that I consume? So in many ways, taking a psychedelic is like taking the red pill to see outside of the matrix. But it's a red pill that is, I think, at the crux rooted in these sort of evolutionary biological truths that we have to anchor and be grounded in that. So even one of the key things that came up for me in this early work was, the more that I can pattern my behaviors around the ways that we've lived as humans for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, the healthier I will be. So minimizing blue light at night, eating a paleo diet, getting a lot of walking and functional movement, getting sunlight outside, right? So it totally shifted how I thought about my own health and well-being. And now, and that's been the last decade of my life that I've really dedicated to. And now I'm interested in, well, what does it mean for how we collectively live as well? And so I think what I'm becoming more and more interested is, what is the pattern that is emerging about how we are wanting to live in community, right? One thing that was really big in the 60s was communes.
Yeah, true.
And communes wouldn't have happened without psychedelics. Psychedelics were sort of the catalyst or the opener to figure out how do we live in communes. Now, if you start to study communes a little bit, you come to recognize and realize that how we have lived, or how we lived in an indigenous way, sort of mimics a lot of what these communes wanted to do, except the indigenous peoples did it much better. And so I think that the next pattern to open up and come to recognize and realize is, how do we intentionally design our collective living experience to be aligned with sort of our biological necessities? and being in community, being in relationship, even things like childcare, right? A nuclear family has been great, but when we live in these isolated homes in suburbs, it's actually not how we're meant to live and raise kids and be in that way. So I think starting to angle how we choose to live based on how we have lived for so long would be another kind of key pattern to step into and recognize and be part of.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great way to look at it. And just to put the cherry on the top for the folks listening, one of the main things that helped build those communities was, wait for it, storytelling
Right.
around the fire and building those communities. I
Totally.
love to nerd out about that part of it so much, dude. Paul, thank you so much for being here. This was a unique episode, but something I was personally really excited about. This has been something I've been studying myself, not to the degree that you have, but I appreciate the work that you're doing in the world so much, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother. It's been good. It's been good to be on. I would encourage folks to go to thethirdwave.co, start there, check out our platform, education, lots of things that you can go down, and reach out to me. If you have questions, I'm on social, as you've talked about. So find me, ping me. I'm happy to help anyone who might have questions about this topic and go a little deeper.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, man. My name is Rain Bennett. Thanks for listening. If you're already a subscriber and you're enjoying the show, give us a review and let us know the value that you've gotten from it. We love to hear from our listeners and learn about the benefits that they're getting from the show. That's what fuels us, and that's what fuels the show. And if you've already subscribed and you've already reviewed it and you think there's someone else that would benefit from listening to this show, please share it with them. The more we grow, the more we can help you grow, and that's what we're here to do. Join us next time on the Storytelling Lab.